The city's most feared mafia boss, Lorenzo DeSantis, slid into the back seat of his bulletproof SUV after a long night of negotiations. He didn't look up. He didn't need to. No one in the city dared make a sound around him. But before he could close the door, a tiny voice snapped through the silence. "Shut up." Lorenzo froze. No one in his entire life had ever spoken to him like that. He slowly turned his head. A little girl, no older than 7, was sitting in the corner of the back seat, knees pulled to her chest, eyes red from crying. She wasn't scared of him. She wasn't intimidated. She was shaking from something else entirely. Lorenzo frowned. "Who put you in my car?" "Be quiet," she whispered again. "Please don't say anything. He'll hear you." Lorenzo's heartbeat slammed against his ribs. He'd survived ambushes, betrayals, shootouts, but nothing unnerved him like the terror in her voice. "Who?" he demanded. Her eyes slowly lifted to meet his, but they weren't looking at him. They were looking past him, at the tinted window, at the dark street outside. "He's coming," she said. "He told me not to scream. But when he saw your car, he ran to get his knife." And for the first time in years, the mafia boss felt something he wasn't used to. Cold, real, fear. Because when Lorenzo turned to check the street, he recognized the shadow approaching, a man he thought was dead, a ghost from his past, the only person who ever swore he would come back for revenge and take the boss's child to hurt him. Except Lorenzo didn't have a daughter. So who was this girl? And why did the ghost want her? His world began to collapse. Stay with me until the end, because what that little girl reveals next will expose the one secret the mafia boss swore he'd buried forever. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's get started. Lorenzo had built an empire on fear and respect. For 30 years, his name alone could silence a room full of hardened criminals. He owned judges, controlled politicians, and commanded an army of loyal soldiers who would die for him without question. But sitting in that back seat, staring at this terrified child, he felt powerless for the first time since he was a boy himself. The girl pressed herself deeper into the corner of the seat, her small frame trembling like a leaf in a hurricane. Her clothes were dirty and torn, suggesting she'd been running for hours, maybe days. But it wasn't her appearance that struck Lorenzo the most. It was her eyes. They held a depth of pain that no child should ever carry. "What's your name?" Lorenzo asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. The girl shook her head frantically. "No names. He knows names. He finds people when he knows their names." Lorenzo's mind raced through possibilities. Who was this man approaching? The shadow he'd glimpsed looked familiar. Hauntingly so, but his rational mind rejected what his instincts were telling. Him. Antonio Marchetti was dead. Lorenzo had watched him die 12 years ago in that warehouse fire. He'd made sure of it. But as the footsteps grew closer on the pavement outside, Lorenzo's certainty began to crack. The gait was wrong, uneven, like someone favoring an injured leg. Antonio had walked with that same limp after the car accident that nearly killed him before the fire finished the job. "Listen to me," Lorenzo said, reaching slowly into his jacket. The girl's eyes widened with fresh terror, but instead of a weapon, he pulled out his phone. "I'm going to call my driver. We're going to get you somewhere safe." "No," the girl hissed, grabbing his wrist with surprising strength. "He has people everywhere. He told me so. He said even the police work for him now. He said no one would believe me because I'm just a street kid and he's important." The words hit Lorenzo like physical blows. This wasn't random. Whoever was hunting this child had planned this carefully, systematically destroying her trust in any authority that might help her. It was a tactic Lorenzo himself had used countless times to isolate his enemies. "How long has he been chasing you?" Lorenzo asked. 3 days, she whispered. "Maybe 4. I lost count. He took me from the shelter where I was staying, said I was special, said I was going to help him get back at someone who hurt him real bad." Lorenzo's blood turned to ice. The shelter. There was only one children's shelter in the city that operated under his family's protection, a place where his late wife, Maria, had volunteered before cancer took her, a place where they'd quietly funded improvements and security upgrades for years, ensuring the most vulnerable children had somewhere safe to go. "What shelter?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "St. Catherine's. The lady there, Sister Margaret, she tried to stop him, but he had a gun. He said if anyone called the police, he'd come back and hurt all the other kids too." Lorenzo closed his eyes, pieces of a horrifying puzzle clicking into place. St. Catherine's wasn't just any shelter. It was the place where Maria had spent her final months, reading to children, organizing art therapy sessions, pouring her maternal instincts into kids who had nowhere else to turn. After her death, Lorenzo had continued supporting the shelter anonymously, seeing it as the last connection to his wife's gentle spirit. But there was something else about St. Catherine's that made his chest tighten with dread, something he'd buried so deep that even thinking about it felt like reopening an old wound. 15 years ago, before Maria's illness, they'd tried to have children. Month after month of hope followed by crushing disappointment. The doctors had eventually delivered the devastating news that Maria couldn't carry a child to term. The grief had nearly destroyed their marriage. In desperation, they'd explored adoption. They'd even gotten as far as meeting with a pregnant teenager at St. Catherine's, a girl who'd chosen them to raise her baby. They'd prepared a nursery, bought clothes, dreamed of sleepless nights and first steps and birthday parties. But the girl had changed her mind at the last minute, deciding to keep the baby herself. Lorenzo and Maria had been heartbroken but supportive, even helping the young mother get back on her feet. They'd never learned what happened to the girl or her child after that. The girl in his back seat shifted, and something about her profile in the dim streetlight made Lorenzo's breath catch. The shape of her nose, the curve of her chin, even the way she tucked her hair behind her ear. It was achingly familiar. "What's your mother's name?" he asked quietly. The girl looked at him with confusion. "I don't have a mother. Sister Margaret said she died when I was little. Car accident or something? I don't remember her." Lorenzo's hands began to shake. The timeline fit, the location fit, but it was impossible, wasn't it? "Do you remember anything about before the shelter?" He pressed gently. "Any other family? Any stories about where you came from?" The girl shrugged. "Sister Margaret said my mom was real young when she had me. Said she tried real hard to take care of me, but things got bad. Drugs or something. That's all I know." The footsteps outside had stopped. Lorenzo peered through the tinted window and saw a figure standing under a streetlight about 50 feet away. Even from that distance, even after 12 years, even with the scars that covered half his face, Lorenzo knew exactly who it was. Antonio Marchetti, his former lieutenant, his brother-in-arms, his greatest betrayal, the man who'd discovered Lorenzo's secret adoption plans all those years ago, the man who'd used that information to try to extort money from rival families, the man who'd threatened to expose every vulnerable detail of Lorenzo's personal life for profit, the man Lorenzo had left to burn alive in that warehouse, believing justice had been served. But Antonio hadn't died. He'd survived, scarred and twisted by hatred, spending 12 years planning his revenge, and somehow, impossibly, he'd found the one thing that could hurt Lorenzo more than any physical torture, the child he and Maria had never gotten to raise. Lorenzo's mind reeled as the pieces of his past came crashing together like a violent collision. The scarred figure under the streetlight began moving again, but not toward the car. He was circling it slowly, deliberately, like a predator savoring the hunt. The little girl's breathing became more rapid. "He's playing with us," she whispered. "He likes to make people scared before he hurts them. He told me that's the best part." Lorenzo felt his protective instincts surge, something primal and fierce that he hadn't experienced since Maria's death. This child, whoever she was, had sought refuge in his car. She'd trusted him enough to warn him about danger. That meant something in his world. "Tell me, exactly what he said to you," Lorenzo commanded quietly, his voice carrying the authority that had built his empire. Every word you can remember. The girl's eyes darted between Lorenzo and the window. He said he was taking me to see my real daddy. Said my daddy was a bad man who needed to learn what it felt like to lose everything he cared about. But I don't have a daddy. Sister Margaret told me he died before I was born. Lorenzo's blood turned to acid in his veins. The timeline was becoming clearer, more horrifying with each revelation. If Antonio had somehow discovered the connection between this child and the adoption that never happened, if he'd pieced together the truth about her parentage, then this wasn't just revenge. This was psychological warfare designed to destroy Lorenzo from the inside out. What else did he tell you about your father? Lorenzo pressed. The girl wiped her nose with the back of her hand. He said he used to work with him. Said they were friends until my daddy betrayed him real bad. He showed me pictures on his phone of a big house with gardens and said that should have been where I grew up if my daddy wasn't so selfish. Lorenzo's hands clenched into fists. The house Antonio had shown her was undoubtedly the estate Lorenzo had shared with Maria, the gardens she'd tended with such care, dreaming of children who would play among the roses and chase butterflies across the manicured lawns. But there was something else nagging at Lorenzo's memory, something about the young mother who'd chosen to keep her baby 15 years ago. Her name had been Sarah Marchetti. At the time, Lorenzo had assumed it was coincidence that she shared a surname with his lieutenant. Italian names were common in their neighborhood, but what if it hadn't been coincidence? What if Sarah was Antonio's sister? What if Antonio had orchestrated the entire adoption scenario as some twisted long-term plan that had only now come to fruition? The scarred figure outside had completed his circle and was now standing directly in front of the SUV. Even through the bulletproof glass and tinting, Lorenzo could see the grotesque smile spreading across Antonio's ruined face. Antonio raised his hand and tapped on the hood of the car with something metallic. The sound echoed through the interior like a death knell. "He wants us to get out," the girl said, her voice barely audible. "He always taps like that when he wants me to come to him. But I won't go. I can't go back to the room where he keeps me." "What room?" Lorenzo asked, though he dreaded the answer. "The basement room with no windows. He has pictures on the walls. Pictures of you and a pretty lady. He talks to them sometimes, telling them how he's going to make you pay for leaving him to die." Lorenzo's vision blurred with rage. Antonio hadn't just survived the warehouse fire. He'd spent 12 years in that basement, surrounded by images of Lorenzo and Maria, feeding his hatred until it consumed whatever humanity he'd once possessed. The tapping on the hood stopped. Antonio was walking around to the driver's side now, his limp more pronounced than before. Lorenzo could see him more clearly through the side window. The burns covered the entire left side of his face and neck, twisting his features into something barely recognizable as human. But his eyes were exactly the same, cold, calculating, filled with the same ambition that had made him dangerous even when Lorenzo trusted him. Antonio pressed his face against the window, his scarred lips moving as he spoke words Lorenzo couldn't hear through the soundproofing, but he could read lips well enough to understand the message. "Come out and play, Lorenzo. Time to settle old debts." The girl grabbed Lorenzo's arm. "Please don't leave me with him. I know you're important like he is, but you seem different. You seem sad instead of angry." Lorenzo looked down at her small hand on his sleeve. Such a simple gesture, but it carried the weight of absolute trust. This child had been terrorized for days, hunted like an animal, threatened with unspeakable violence. Yet she'd found the courage to warn him about danger and ask for his protection. In that moment, Lorenzo made a decision that would change everything. He wasn't going to run. He wasn't going to call for backup. He wasn't going to handle this like a business transaction or a territorial dispute. This was personal. This was family. And family meant everything. "Listen to me very carefully," Lorenzo said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his heart. "I'm going to get out of this car, but you're going to stay here. These doors lock automatically, and this glass can stop bullets. You'll be safe." The girl's grip on his arm tightened. "What if he hurts you? What if he has a gun?" "Then you use my phone to call the number I'm going to show you," Lorenzo said, pulling out his device and scrolling to a contact labeled simply as family. "These people will come for you no matter what happens to me. They'll keep you safe and find you a real home with people who will love you." "But what about your real daddy?" she asked. "What if he comes looking for me?" Lorenzo's throat tightened. He looked at this brave, broken little girl who'd risked everything to save a stranger, and he saw Maria's compassion reflected in her eyes. He saw the child they'd dreamed of raising, the daughter they'd never gotten to tuck into bed or read stories to or teach about the world. "Maybe he already has," Lorenzo whispered. Lorenzo reached for the door handle, but the girl's voice stopped him cold. "Wait, there's something else you need to know about him. About why he really wants me." Lorenzo's hand froze on the metal. Outside, Antonio had stopped moving entirely, standing motionless under the streetlight like a statue carved from hatred and scars. "What else?" Lorenzo asked, though every instinct screamed at him to get out there and end this nightmare once and for all. The girl's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "He has a box, full of papers and pictures. He showed me some of them when he was trying to make me understand why I was special to him." Lorenzo's blood turned to ice. "What kind of papers?" "Birth certificates, hospital records, legal documents with big stamps on them, and pictures of a lady in a hospital bed holding a baby. She looked really sick, but really happy." The world tilted sideways. Lorenzo gripped the leather seat so hard his knuckles went white. Maria. It had to be Maria during one of their hospital visits, one of their failed attempts at fertility treatments. But how would Antonio have gotten those photographs? The girl continued, unaware that she was systematically destroying Lorenzo's understanding of his own life. "He said the lady in the picture was supposed to be my new mommy, but she got too sick and died. He said my real mommy was his sister, and she gave me to the people in the big house, but then they changed their minds and sent me away." Lorenzo couldn't breathe. The pieces weren't just falling into place anymore. They were crashing down like an avalanche, burying everything he thought he knew about his past. Sarah Marchetti hadn't changed her mind about the adoption. Someone had changed it for her. "Did he tell you what happened to your mother?" Lorenzo managed to ask. The girl nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "He said she tried to take me back after I was born, but the people in the big house didn't want me anymore because the lady got sick. So my mommy had to raise me by herself, but she was just a teenager and didn't have any money. He said she started using drugs to make the sadness go away, and that's what killed her." Lorenzo felt something break inside his chest. Not just his heart, something deeper. His entire sense of who he was and what his life had meant. Maria had never recovered from losing that adoption. She'd thrown herself into charity work, spending countless hours at St. Catherine's. But Lorenzo had always sensed she was trying to fill a void that nothing could touch. When the cancer came, she'd fought it with the desperation of someone who felt she had unfinished business in the world. What if that unfinished business had been this child? What if Maria had died believing they'd abandoned a baby who needed them? Antonio began moving again, his scarred face pressed against the passenger window now. His lips were moving, forming words that chilled Lorenzo to the bone even though he couldn't hear them through the bulletproof glass. "She's mine now. She was always mine. You stole my sister's life, so I'm taking her daughter." The girl saw Antonio's face and immediately curled into a tighter ball. "That's what he looks like when he's about to hurt someone. Please don't let him take me back to the basement. I promise I'll be good. I won't ask for food or water or anything." Lorenzo's vision went red. The basement. Antonio had kept this child, this innocent 7-year-old, locked in a basement for days, starving her, terrorizing her, using her as bait in his twisted game of revenge. Every code Lorenzo lived by, every rule that governed his world, demanded swift and brutal justice for what Antonio had done. But there was something else driving him now, something more powerful than the laws of the underworld. Paternal instinct. raw and fierce and undeniable. He looked at the girl's tear-streaked face and saw Maria's gentle eyes staring back at him. He saw the daughter they'd dreamed of raising, the child who should have grown up safe and loved in their home, surrounded by gardens and birthday parties and bedtime stories. Instead, she'd grown up on the streets, bouncing between shelters, believing herself unwanted and alone, all because of Antonio's manipulation and Lorenzo's ignorance. The rage that filled Lorenzo then was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. It wasn't the cold, calculated anger of a businessman eliminating competition. It wasn't the strategic fury of a general planning a war. This was the wrath of a father whose child had been stolen from him. "You're not going back to any basement," Lorenzo said, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "And you're never going to be hungry or scared again. Do you understand me?" The girl studied his face with the wisdom that only comes from surviving trauma. "You promise? Even if it means you get hurt?" "I promise. Even if it costs me everything." Antonio had moved to the back of the SUV now, and Lorenzo could hear the faint sound of metal scraping against metal. He was trying to find a weak point in the armor, probing for a way inside. But Lorenzo wasn't going to wait for Antonio to find one. He'd spent enough of his life reacting to other people's moves, letting circumstances control his destiny. This time, he was going to take control. "Listen carefully," Lorenzo said, pulling his phone from his jacket and pressing it into the girl's small hands. "I'm going to step outside for just a few minutes. While I'm gone, I want you to press this green button and say exactly these words. 'Uncle Vincent, Lorenzo needs the family at St. Catherine's shelter right now. Emergency protocol? Can you remember that? Uncle Vincent? But I don't know any Uncle Vincent.' You will soon," Lorenzo said softly. "Vincent is my brother. He's going to be your uncle too, if you want him to be. He's going to make sure you're safe while I take care of the bad man outside." The girl's grip tightened on the phone. "What if you don't come back? What if he kills you like he said he was going to?" Lorenzo reached out and gently touched her cheek, the same gesture he'd seen Maria make countless times with the children at the shelter. "Then you tell Uncle Vincent that Lorenzo said to take care of his daughter. Tell him to give you everything I never got the chance to." "Your daughter? But I thought you said you didn't have any children." "I was wrong about a lot of things," Lorenzo said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I'm not wrong about this. You're mine to protect now, and I don't let anyone hurt what's mine." He opened the car door slowly, stepping out into the cold night air. Antonio was waiting for him at the rear of the SUV, a long knife gleaming in his scarred hand. "Lorenzo, my old friend," Antonio said, his voice a raspy whisper damaged by smoke and fire. "I was wondering when you'd finally grow a spine and face me." "Hello, Antonio. I have to say, death hasn't improved your looks." Antonio laughed, a sound like broken glass grinding together. 12 years, Lorenzo. 12 years I spent in agony planning this moment. Do you know what it's like to have your skin melt off your bones? To spend months learning how to walk again? How to speak again? How to hate again? "I imagine it was educational," Lorenzo replied calmly, though his muscles were coiled like springs. "You always were a slow learner. But I learned, didn't I? I learned that the best revenge isn't quick. It's not a bullet to the head or a knife between the ribs. The best revenge is taking everything someone loves and making them watch it die slowly." "Is that what you did to your sister? Made her die slowly while I was none the wiser?" Antonio's smile faltered for just a moment. "Sarah made her own choices. I just helped her understand the consequences of trusting the wrong people. You killed her as surely as if you'd put the needle in her arm yourself. She was 19 years old, Antonio. A child with a baby trying to do the right thing." "The right thing?" Antonio snarled, raising the knife. "The right thing would have been letting you and that barren wife of yours adopt my niece like you promised. Instead, you got cold feet when Maria got sick. Decided a dying woman couldn't raise a child, so you broke that little girl's heart and sent her away with nothing." Lorenzo felt the truth hit him like a physical blow. They hadn't gotten cold feet. They'd never even known Sarah had changed her mind back. Someone had intercepted the communications, manipulated the adoption agency, made sure the papers never got signed. You sabotaged the adoption, Lorenzo breathed. You wanted Sarah to keep the baby so you could use her as leverage later. I wanted my sister to see what kind of man you really were. Selfish, cruel, the kind of man who abandons a pregnant teenager when his own problems get too complicated. But your plan backfired, didn't it? Sarah kept the baby, but she also kept believing I'd betrayed her. The drugs weren't about losing me, Antonio. They were about losing hope. Antonio's scarred face twisted with rage. She was weak, just like you're weak. Just like that spawn of hers cowering in your car is weak. But don't worry, Lorenzo. I'm going to fix that. I'm going to teach her how to be strong by showing her what happens to weak men who think they can play God with other people's lives. Lorenzo took a step forward, his hands steady despite the fury, burning in his chest. The only thing you're going to teach her is what justice looks like when it finally catches up to monsters like you. Antonio lunged with the knife, but Lorenzo was ready. 30 years of surviving in a world where violence was currency had taught him to read the subtle shifts in posture, the tiny tells that preceded an attack. He sidestepped the blade and grabbed Antonio's wrist, twisting until he heard bones crack. The knife clattered to the pavement, but Antonio wasn't finished. He threw a wild punch with his free hand, catching Lorenzo in the ribs. The pain was sharp but familiar. Lorenzo had been hurt worse by better men than Antonio Marchetti. He drove his elbow into Antonio's solar plexus, doubling him over, then brought his knee up to meet Antonio's descending face. The impact was solid, final. Antonio crumpled to the ground, blood streaming from his nose, his scarred features even more grotesque in the harsh streetlight. Lorenzo stood over him, breathing hard but victorious. For a moment, he felt the old satisfaction of a problem solved through force, but then he heard the soft sound of the car door opening behind him. "Mr. Lorenzo?" The girl's voice called out tentatively. "Is the bad man going to hurt me anymore?" Lorenzo turned to see her standing beside the SUV, his phone still clutched in her small hands. She looked so fragile in the harsh light, so young and vulnerable despite everything she'd endured. "No, sweetheart," Lorenzo said gently. "The bad man is never going to hurt anyone again." But even as he said the words, he knew this was only the beginning. Antonio was finished, but the damage he'd done would take years to repair. This child, this daughter Lorenzo had never known he had, would need time and patience and love to heal from the trauma she'd suffered. Lorenzo was a man who'd built his life on power and fear and carefully calculated risks. But looking at this little girl, he realized he was about to embark on the most dangerous venture of his career. He was going to learn how to be a father, and for the first time in 30 years, Lorenzo DeSantis had no idea if he was strong enough for the challenge ahead. The sound of approaching sirens pierced the night air, growing louder with each passing second. Lorenzo looked down at Antonio's unconscious form, then back at the little girl who was watching him with those impossibly wise eyes. She stepped closer, her bare feet silent on the cold pavement. "Are you really my daddy?" she asked, her voice carrying a hope so fragile it could shatter with the wrong word. Lorenzo knelt down to her level, studying her face in the streetlight. Now that he knew what to look for, the resemblance was undeniable. She had Maria's gentle eyes and stubborn chin, but there was something else there too. Something that reminded him of himself at that age, before the world had hardened him into the man he'd become. "I think I am," he said softly. "But I need you to know something important I never knew about you. If I had known, if I had even suspected you existed, I would have moved heaven and earth to find you." The girl tilted her head, processing this information with the careful consideration of someone who'd learned not to trust promises too quickly. "Sister Margaret used to say my mama talked about a man with kind eyes who was going to give me a good home. She said mama never stopped believing he would come back for me someday." Lorenzo's throat constricted. Maria had been right about one thing. This child should have grown up in their home, surrounded by love and security, instead of bouncing between shelters and living in fear. The weight of those lost years pressed down on him like a physical force. "What's your name?" he asked. "Your real name, not what he called you." "Sophia," she whispered. Sophia Rose. Sister Margaret said Mama picked Rose because it was beautiful and strong, and roses can grow even when the ground is hard. Sophia Rose. Lorenzo repeated the name like a prayer. Maria would have loved that name. She spent hours in our garden tending to her roses. She always said they were survivors, just like the children at the shelter. The sirens were getting closer now. Red and blue lights flickered against the buildings at the end of the street. Lorenzo knew he had minutes at most before this scene would be swarming with police, reporters, and questions he wasn't ready to answer. "Sophia, I need you to listen carefully. Those police cars are coming because someone called them about the bad man. When they get here, they're going to want to ask you lots of questions about what happened. Are you ready for that?" Sophia nodded, her small hand slipping into his with surprising trust. "I'm ready, but can I stay with you? I don't want to be alone anymore." Lorenzo squeezed her hand gently as the first police car rounded the corner, its headlights cutting through the darkness. For 30 years, he'd ruled through fear and intimidation, but in this moment, holding the hand of the daughter he'd never known existed, he discovered something more powerful than any empire he'd ever built: the courage to protect what truly mattered. Antonio Marchetti had wanted revenge. He'd wanted to destroy Lorenzo by taking away everything he loved, but his twisted plan had backfired in the most beautiful way possible. Instead of losing everything, Lorenzo had found the one thing that had been missing from his life all along: a family worth fighting for. As the police cars surrounded them and officers began shouting orders, Lorenzo kept his eyes on Sophia. She looked up at him with complete trust. No longer the terrified child who'd hidden in his back seat. She was his daughter, and nothing would ever separate them again. Sometimes the most unexpected encounters change everything. A mafia boss who thought he'd lost his humanity discovered it in the courage of a 7-year-old girl, and a child who'd spent her life believing she was unwanted finally found the father who'd been searching for her without even knowing it. Justice had been served, but more importantly, a family had been born from the ashes of betrayal and revenge.